Everyone, and welcome to tonight's Curator Talk with Katherine Benjamin on the Freedom Trail Foundation's Rainbow Revolutionaries walking tour. My name is Callie Johnston, and I'm the Summer Events and Outreach Intern for the History Project. In case anyone here is new to the History Project, welcome! We are Boston's queer community archives, dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing Boston's LGBTQ plus history. If you're interested in Boston's queer and trans history, please be sure to follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter to learn about our upcoming events and activities. All of those links, our Instagram, Linktree, the newsletter sign-up form, should be in the chat right now or very shortly. And finally, a quick invitation. Our annual History Maker Award ceremony will take place on Tuesday, September 30th. This fundraiser event will remember 45 years of the History Project, honor our founders as this year's history makers, and present the annual Lavender Rhino Award to local activist on the ground Kim Topping, and also reveal our organization's new name and branding, so you won't want to miss this, I promise. The link to register is on our Eventbrite and also in the chat. Now, on to tonight's event. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator, Theo Linger, board member of the History Project. Welcome, Theo. And our featured curator, Katherine Benjamin. Katherine Benjamin, she, her, has over a decade of experience in historical interpretation and museum education. She began her career leading tours in Salem, interpreting the complex history of the witch trials, and went on to specialize in immersive historical experiences at the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum. Since 2022, Katherine has served as programs manager at the Freedom Trail Foundation, where she oversees more than 25 tour guides and manages all specialty tours and educational programming. She developed, researched, and authored the Foundation's first new tour in over 6 years, a walking tour highlighting Boston's LGBTQ plus history. Passionate about making history inclusive and engaging, Katherine is dedicated to amplifying underrepresented voices and connecting audiences to the diverse human stories that have shaped our collective past. The History Project will also be attending a special iteration of the tour next Thursday, August 21st at 6 p.m. You can get your tickets at thefreedomtrail.org, link also in the chat. Thank you. Now take it away, Theo and Katherine.
Thank you so much, Callie. All right. So thank you for joining us tonight, Kat. It's great to be able to talk to you about this amazing tour. To get us started, would you mind giving us a summary of what the tour is, what kind of stops you make, that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Theo and Callie and everyone. Happy to be here. So the Rainbow Revolutionaries tour is a walking tour on Boston's Freedom Trail, and it's a guided tour, of course. It makes 7 stops along the trail, and some of these stops are also not official Freedom Trail sites, but what we call stops off the trail, or steps off the trail. So they're very nearby Freedom Trail, the red brick line on Boston's sidewalk, which marks the Freedom Trail. However, they're not part of the 16 official sites of the Freedom Trail. Now, the Rainbow Revolutionaries Tour highlights the LGBTQ plus history of Boston, and it covers many centuries of history. So it's not just 1900s and beyond. It goes all the way into history in the 1600s. It starts around the Massachusetts State House. It goes into Beacon Hill, goes to the Beacon Hill Friends House, the George Middleton House, goes through Boston Common, stops at the Tremont Theater, or now called the Tremont Temple, the Old Corner Bookstore, and ends around Boston City Hall.
Amazing. Where did the idea for this tour come from, and who did the research and writing for it?
Yeah, so I joined the Freedom Trail Foundation team in 2022, and I think a few months into being there, we had a pretty bare bones staff at the time. We were just kind of coming back from pandemic times, and we were bringing back on some of the guides who had worked with us in the past. And one of those guides, as we were bringing her back on, kind of revisited that she had this idea of creating an LGBTQ history tour. She had really not gotten a whole lot started with it, but she kind of compiled a list of of some of the historic figures or events and things that would be interesting to talk about and would make this tour relevant. Specifically highlighting like Massachusetts' involvement in the legalization of same-sex marriage and some of the queer politicians that are kind of the firsts that we see here in Massachusetts. So I was excited to hear that this is something that she had been thinking about, that, there was some interest in this already. I was, this is something I'm passionate about. And so I talked to her. I kind of got her and the executive director of the foundation in a meeting to discuss, can we develop this idea and can we make this a reality? And then took it from there. So I am the programs manager at the Freedom Trail Foundation, and I am a team of one, essentially. I do not have anyone who works with me on programs. So when it came to developing this, it was up to me to self-motivate, to do this research. Didn't really have folks who could work with me in terms of people who are on the Freedom Trail Foundation team. We're just really small. So I did this research independently and worked on writing and developing this tour over the course of several months, close to a year, and wanted to have it ready for June 2024. So that's when we debuted the tour.
Great. That was fantastic.
Oh, and I want to mention the name of that person was Kelly Strong, just so that she gets, yeah, she did a wonderful job bringing that to our
Thank
attention
you.
and having that research. Yeah.
Right. So while you were doing all this research, what sorts of sources did you use?
Yeah, so I was drawing from a lot of different sources. I think I was going into the community. There's a lot of really great resources or research that has been done locally already. So I was really happy to have resources from places like the History Project, from historic house museums like the Gibson House, Longfellow House. There are all these museums that you can actually go to that are doing queer interpretation already and have done a lot of research on it, and that's wonderful to have. Organizations like the New England Historical Society, the Massachusetts Historical Society, that have lots of great records that are available online for use. I used the book Improper Bostonians, which is also a history project publication from the 90s, I believe. And using a lot of National Park Service websites research that was done by a lot of fantastic national park staff members. They had a Boston queer history audio tour that was available, I believe, for free for download.
Yep.
Yeah, that was a really great resource that they put a lot of great research into. And then, even using primary sources when I can. I think we'll talk a little bit about how that can be difficult in finding queer history. But, there's poetry from some of these women who are in Boston marriages that I was able to read, and you can really read between those lines and see the real love and care and romance and eroticism that's in some of these poems. And reading, journal entries from people like Charlie Gibson has a lot of writing. And then also, things like Boston Globe articles, other newspaper articles. So really drawing from lots and lots of different sources to
Sorry, that
find
you
as
feel.
much as I can.
Oh, and now it stopped.
Yep. I'm hearing somebody isn't muted. If that's okay. Could you please make sure? Thank you. Yeah, sorry about that, Kat.
No worries.
So yeah, sorry, as you were saying.
No, I think that was kind of the conclusion of that.
Yeah, okay. So you mentioned kind of difficulty with primary sources. Could you say more about that? What other challenges did you run into while researching?
Yeah, so I think, anyone who's tried to do queer history research is no stranger to how this can be a difficult part of a person's identity to research and bring to light and talk about for a number of reasons, especially like going back multiple centuries of history. There's many periods of time in, New England's history where same-sex relationships or same-sex intimacy are made illegal, can be punishable by jail, by in some cases death. Um, there's threat to people in the past for living as an out queer person. And for that reason, a lot of queer people maybe destroyed their own belongings or didn't live an out life and didn't there's not records that exist of their life as a queer person. Um, out of self-preservation, also out of just people not having the same language that we have today to talk about queer identities, or just, that there are lots of different ways that people use language in the past to talk about what we now term things like lesbian, gay, transgender, non-binary. Those kinds of words were not always in the vernacular for, centuries ago. So it can be difficult to figure out how someone identified, and we don't want to necessarily prescribe an identity to somebody that they maybe didn't actually self-identify with. Um, but I think something that I've also, learned through working in this field and doing this research, I'm probably going to bring this person up later on as well, but there's a exhibit designer, and consultant named Margaret Middleton, who wrote this really great article and also like a zine called Queer Possibilities. And one thing that they say is, when weighing the risk of accidental queering against queer erasure, it's more just to err on the side of queerness. So this idea that if we can find evidence, as people who kind of understand the queer experience of what seems like some kind of queer living, same-sex love, living outside the gender binary, can we bring those stories to light, even if that person didn't have the language to maybe to self-identify in a particular way, that it is more just to share the stories of someone who at least lived outside of the binary or lived outside of like cis heteronormative society, because it is true that queer people have existed for all of human history. And even if we don't have like solid evidence in the way that some other historians do their research, that it is an issue of justice to bring these stories to light. So basically, doing my research, I'm going to come up against people who have destroyed evidence of their living as a queer person or whose evidence just doesn't really exist, but where there is enough that can be discerned from reading about their lives, reading about how they lived, who they lived with, what they, who they spent their time with, who they devoted, things like, who they willed their possessions to, or dedicated their artwork to, or whatever it may be, that you can kind of infer how this person loved and how they lived, and that is going to be a service to the queer community at large to bring these stories to light, that people have been living queer lives for centuries, for all of human history.
Absolutely. And I really love what you said, quoting from Middleton about erring on the side of queerness, because doing this research, you often do run into almost a double standard of this higher burden of proof. Uh, More of the how do you know when you're talking about a potential queer person, when, the reverse is never asked of how do you know this person was straight or
Right.
cisgender? Like, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, and you mentioned the National Park Service sources. So, as many of us may know, a lot of those sources are now no longer available, um, due to the course of current events, we might say. Um, how do you think that might affect somebody trying to do this research now?
Yeah, so I did mention like a lot, I would say like a good at least 50% of my research perhaps came from National Park Service sources. And I was doing this research in late 2023 and early mid 2024. So all of this was available very publicly online and really easy to get. And It was great research. Um, and I, I don't know, it would have been a lot harder to do what I did to find these stories and find these people's histories and bring them to light if I didn't have access to those sources and they weren't so easy to acquire. So I think it just would is inevitably going to be a harder task in some ways to find research about queer people going forward. It's starting to become just a more challenging task because there's just attempts to take down and erase existing research, existing exhibitions in some of the museums that are out there, are not bringing queer historians in to invite them to present or to have exhibitions and I don't know, that kind of thing. So, but in terms of the National Park Service, yeah, it's an incredible resource to have National Park Service history available. It's one of the greatest public history sources that we have in America. And there's just no way I could have done this with as much, still wasn't an easy process, but it was such a lovely thing to have those resources available to me and just rewarding to know that that's there. And it is a tragedy that they are no longer quite so available. I know that there's been efforts on behalf of many organizations to try to archive things that were national park sites somewhere where they are kept safe. So I hope that is going strong and that they exist somewhere, that they're not totally lost to time. I know that that's the case in for many things, but that they are a little harder to track down now.
Yes, and that is something that the History Project is also working on. We're hoping to, if we haven't already, get everything that was on the Park Service sites, at least in the Boston area, posted through us. Um, and I really appreciate you saying so as someone who in a past life worked on some of that work, some of those materials for the NPS. Like, it is disheartening to see all these ripple effects out to our peer institutions, making research like this so much harder, but hopefully we can make that easier again. Uh, Getting back into Rainbow Revolutionaries itself, as you're going through the tour, what sorts of themes and overarching questions do you try to emphasize with this tour?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of, the different stops are highlighting different aspects of history or different periods in history. So we start out kind of around the Massachusetts State House and kind of starting with a little bit more modern history, thematically talking about queer political milestones that are, specific to Boston, as much or Boston or Massachusetts. So we've got, so we'll be talking about, of course, the process of Massachusetts becoming the first state to legalize marriage equality in 2004, 2003. And then some of these politicians that are kind of examples of first out politicians or not out or um, in certain roles. Um, then, yeah, so we'll move on. We discuss examples of figures who are deviating from gender norms and kind of cover that thematically in all kinds of cases and cases of people who could be considered today perhaps trans or non-binary versus some people who we have examples of people who probably identified, almost certainly identified actually as a woman, but who dress as a man for social um, gain or for some kind of, um, motivation, some kind of sense of morality, but that's not necessarily reflecting onto their gender presentation, perhaps, with how they identified themselves, and just talking about the gamut of examples that you can kind of see throughout history of these deviations from gender norms. Um, we'll talk about lots of cases in Boston that there are historic house museums that exist where we can see homes where people lived and have ties to queer figures in the history of that house. One of the stops that we have is the George Middleton house that we're really fortunate that's like right on Beacon Hill, and it's the oldest house in Boston. It's still standing, and it's got this amazing history. You can go see it, and ties to Revolutionary history. And the story of George Middleton and Louis Glapion is a really interesting one, and really tied into the Revolutionary period, which is really cool. We also talk about Boston marriages, so that's like a very specific term to Boston, that not everybody knows that term, I guess, but it's, kind of came about as this description of two women living together who are non-married and financially kind of sharing resources and sharing a home. And in many cases, they were romantically involved. Not in all cases. Sometimes this was kind of a convenient way for unmarried women to live and not have to just follow the prescribed get married to a man and have financial security kind of path of life. But in many cases, this is actually the way that two women in love get to live their life, and it was kind of a socially accepted practice, the Boston marriage that a lot of people during this like late 1800s and early 1900s period is not uncommon and was so common in Boston that the city has the name for it. So gets to have that name. Um, and then kind of concluding, talking about, queer joy continuing in Boston, the history of the Pride Parade. How is it going today? How is Boston representing its queer legacy today? And yeah, all of that.
Um, so if anyone is familiar with the Freedom Trail Foundation, we pretty much associate them with the guides in period costume. Are the guides dressed up for this tour? How does that enter in?
Yes, so our guides are dressed up in costume for this tour. For pretty much the majority of our tours, they are wearing 18th century colonial attire. And for this tour, so for the tour that we do daily, that's more of the revolutionary focus tour that follows the Freedom Trail from Boston Common to Faneuil Hall. They're portraying one historic figure who's kind of one of the lesser known people in Boston, but who was a real person, and they do all kinds of meticulous research to portray this one individual while they're giving their tour. In the case of the Rainbow Revolutionaries tour, we're taking kind of a different tack with this, and they will be dressing in 18th century colonial clothing, but they're given all of the guides kind of have the freedom to decide how do they want to represent themselves, and many of them are kind of augmenting and adopting attire that's not necessarily like the traditional gender presentation of that attire. So we'll have just like mixing of feminine and masculine 18th century colonial attire. And it can be, someone might choose to dress in what would be considered the complete opposite attire of perhaps their like assumed gender presentation, or just kind of a blend, maybe what would a non-binary person wear in the 18th century if they were given the freedom to dress in a way that felt gender affirming, is kind of the idea behind it. But then, some folks will dress in just the traditional attire, and if they're a cis presenting person, then they decide I'm just going to dress this way. That they're 18th century as well. But in general, the representation of their character is meant to be this is a queer person from 18th century Boston. In that time, they'll be walking down the street. You won't know that they're queer just based on looking at them if they're just wearing what every other, woman is wearing in the 18th century, but they're still a queer person. Queer people existed in the 18th century. They would have walked among everyone else and looked like everybody else. And so they're representing kind of the general, uh, the general public of queer individuals from Boston who existed.
That is very cool. I like that approach. Um, let's see. So for all these different guides that you were just talking about, do you know if any of these guides emphasize different things on the tour, or do they all have to sort of stick to the same script?
Yeah, so I think one thing I haven't mentioned is that the first year that we did this tour, the tours were conducted by one guide. And this year, we have the tours conducted by two guides who are working as a team of two to co-guide the tour. Um, we have a tour outline. So I did this research, I developed this tour, I created a tour outline. It involves the stops that you go to and the general information and people that you highlight, folks that you highlight, stories that you highlight, what's the theme here, and that's your guide um, to be historically interpreting the tour. But there's not necessarily a script that our guides are memorizing. And with all of our tours, we really give folks liberty to try to bring to light and highlight stories that they want to throughout the course of the tour and really make it their own and make it their own story and tell it in the way that resonates with them. So every time you take a Freedom Trail tour of any kinds, but including the Rainbow Revolutionaries tour, it's going to be a different experience. You're going to have different stories told. You're going to have them told in a different way. And, it's not always going to be the same every time. So I know, we have folks that are like part of the tour that are required to talk about, but then there are going to be stories in there that will be different from one person to another who wants to highlight who. I know like one guide really loves telling the story of Margaret Foley, who's this lesbian suffragist who used to kind of heckle anti-suffrage people on Boston Common and had this booming, classically trained singer's voice, and she kind of got this nickname, the Grand Heckler. And she has this amazing like romantic relationship, and it's supported by her grandmother, and it's this really cool story. And one of our guides just really loves it and really emphasizes that story. But that's not necessarily emphasized by all the other guides. Maybe they're talking about other folks. Um, we have a guide who really likes talking about the connection between the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which was drafted by John Adams, and how that was a foundational document that led to the abolishment of slavery in Massachusetts, as well as the legalization of gay marriage in Massachusetts. And that's like all the way back to 1780. Everybody loves talking about Charlotte Cushman. Everybody loves talking about the public universal friend. Like those are stories that you're probably going to hear on all the tours, but how and where and in what way, it's going to be a little different depending on who's your guide.
All right. Yeah, that's very fun as well. And fun to think about, oh, if I was doing this, what would I excuse you do or not do? Um, so was there anything that you had considered for this tour that ended up on the cutting room floor completely just for time or too far off of the trail, anything like that?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges that I had in developing the tour is I start by compiling kind of all of these queer figures, all of these stories, all of these themes that I want to bring to light during the tour. And then there's so many of them. There's so many really cool people in Boston's history. How cool is that? It's amazing. We don't have a shortage of queer people to talk about. But we only have 90 minutes for the tour, and there's walking to do, and there's just never going to be enough time to talk about everybody. I think one of the great things is, again, like I mentioned, how the guides can be flexible with the stories that they're telling, and so some of these folks can get talked about by one guide and not the other, and on any given tour, you can decide today I'm talking about Margaret Foley, but the next day I'm talking about someone else, and that can be like this flexible thing. But I do think that, we had to create a trail, a route for people to walk that is a reasonable distance, that doesn't stray too far from the Freedom Trail itself, since the foundation's job is to preserve and promote the Freedom Trail and its sites. And so we want to make sure that we're highlighting that work. So, we can't go all the way to the Charlie Gibson house or the Longfellow house. That's a really long walk. We unfortunately can't walk all the way there. And I know that there's people that, while doing research I learned about, or that some of the guides brought up, who are really interesting queer figures that just weren't from Massachusetts. We were talking about instances of trans individuals, or talking about, we can talk about Deborah Sampson a little bit because she has some connections to Boston, but she was almost certainly not a trans person. She's just a woman who dressed as a man in order to fight in the war, but lived the rest of her life as a cis woman. But in contrast, Albert Cashier is a person who goes to fight in the war, starts dressing as a man, and then lives the rest of his life as a man. And his friends know him as a man, and he's buried as a man. And we can infer from that that he was a trans person. He was a man, and he existed that way. And it's really different from the case of Deborah Sampson. But Albert Cashier's story primarily takes place in Illinois. So it's not really, we can bring him up as a foil for Deborah Sampson, but we can't really make him a focus of the tour per se. I learned about this really interesting person called Thomas or Thomasine Hall, who lived really fluidly between gender, depending on sort of like what was going to be advantageous for their, they wanted to do different professions, and they served in the military as a man. They worked as a maid as a woman. They, did all kinds of different things as different genders throughout their life. But they're primarily living in Virginia, so not as much tie to Boston. So yeah, there are so many amazing stories to talk about. And then there's just like, how do we focus this in and talk about Boston and talk about the sites on the Freedom Trail? And let's make that our specialization. And there will be hopefully other organizations and institutions who are bringing some of these other stories to light in the places where they are from.
Yeah, that is so, so true. And yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Thomas slash Thomasine Hall, because they were exactly who I thought of when you were talking about your guides, sometimes wearing a mixture of masculine and feminine clothing, since that comes up in the Thomasine Hall story.
Yeah.
Um,
Also in the
but
Public Universal Friend story, if
yes,
which again, I feel like I'm giving a lot away. Come see the tour next
yes,
week
definitely sign
instead
up
and
to
hear
go on the
about
whole
these
thing next
people.
week.
But Public Universal Friend also wears a blend of masculine and feminine clothing, which is really awesome.
Yes, so there's precedent. So all of this hard work and this passion is incredible to see. What has the public's reception been like? Do any specific pieces of feedback come to mind? Has there been any pushback?
Yeah, so I would say that we've been really pleasantly surprised by how positive the feedback has been. When we launched the tour in 2024, we were getting a lot of feedback, a lot of interest from, local reporting. Local radio stations were talking about it with us, local newspapers. We were really fortunate to get some contacts with even some kind of like social media influencer, LGBT travel blogger type folks, who we were able to do some kind of like private tours with. And that was a really cool experience. We met with this couple, Kirsty and Christine, who have an Instagram travel page called On Airplane Mode. We had Meg Ten Eyck, who runs a media platform called Every Queer, and they came and took the tour, and they were, they stand out in terms of their feedback to me. They mentioned that this was, they'd taken queer history tours all over the globe, multi-country, and that this was one of the most intersectional tours that they had encountered, which was really cool, like, and really inspiring. For me, having done all this, I was very affirming to hear that. So mostly, and then people on the tour coming here, getting to take the tour and being so delighted that this exists. Most of the time, not all the time, but I think, a lot of the folks coming to take this tour are queer people who are just so happy to see their stories represented. And especially in something like, I think, the Freedom Trail Foundation, where we do have, this reputation for the revolutionary period of history, and that a lot of people going into the revolutionary period or thinking about it are really like you're gonna be thinking about kind of founding father type folks. Um, a lot of cis white men to talk about around this period of history. I think in all of our tours, we try to highlight a diverse offering of folks who are tied to the revolutionary period and who are involved, and to really show the makeup of Boston society, and how the contributions of many different people were what made that happen. But to be able to say this is Boston's Freedom Trail and we have a lot of queer history to tell you is a really rewarding thing. You know, many of our guides have started sprinkling some of these stories into their regular tour, the folks who got trained on the Rainbow Revolutionaries tour. So I guess, you know, and then you asked about pushback, which, you know, it's there's been like a little bit of it for sure. It happens. I would say the major places where we have seen it are basically Facebook comments sections of, you know, we make a post that's sharing that the dates that the next Rainbow Revolutionaries tours are happening, and we'll get kind of a slew of comments from, I don't know, just some random Facebook users who find this somehow and want to say something mean about it. But they're really drowned out by the positive comments and the positive likes and the positive feedback. And then many of our other social media channels are not seeing that. It's really just like kind of a Facebook specific thing.
Something
Interesting.
about Facebook.
Facebook. And then, you know, I don't know, we'll occasionally get someone, it's usually people who've taken the regular tour with a guide that has some of this history, the queer history that they got trained on, and they'll sprinkle in a little public universal friend story in there, and maybe somebody will be upset that they learned about a queer person on their regular Freedom Trail tour, which you can't please 100% of the people 100% of the time, and it's worth it for, you know, that one non-binary kid that was in that school group who got to hear the story of a non-binary person from the 1700s who existed and feels affirmed by that. And that's more rewarding than, you know, this one guy who's going to hear a million stories about white guys hear this one story about a non-binary person and get upset about it.
Exactly. And I think that slides right into the next question, which is why is a tour like Rainbow Revolutionary is so important in 2025 with everything that's happening?
Yeah, I think it's feeling excruciatingly important right now in 2025, even more than when we launched it in 2024. And, you know, the thing that really feels so important is that queerness has always been here. LGBTQ people have always existed and will always exist. And no amount of attempts to take down sites of public history information that's available to people is going to stop the fact that queer people exist. And it's really important to continue to reflect on the legacy of the LGBTQ lives throughout history, that, you know, here in Boston, all of the wins that we've had, all of the firsts that we've made, and to celebrate those advances, and then to feel inspired, to feel like we deserve to continue to take up space, to move forward, to create more stories, and to have these stories told. It feels like, you know, the something like a walking tour is this continuation of a tradition of oral history, of oral recording and sharing. And this is the oldest way that stories have been archived and passed on to generations. And this is a way that we can continue to tell the stories of queer people and not let these things disappear from everything that we know about human history. And it just feels like so important to continue to share with audiences that if you're a queer person taking this tour and you feel like your story is disappearing, it's still here and you're still going to get to know that, you know, this like even 18th century revolutionary history has you in it.
That is extremely important to remember. And the last question I had before we kind of turn it over to the audience for any questions they might have is, since I'm a public historian, you're a public historian, some of the people in the audience tonight might be public historians, this being a kind of insider baseball sort of conversation. Um, what advice would you give to a public history professional who at their institution is thinking about maybe starting uh, queer history programming?
Yeah. So kind of, to jump off of everything that I was just saying, to first think about it as like, thank you for thinking of doing that. And yes, please do that. And if your institution is going to support you in doing that, or if you can fight for your institution to support you in doing that, we all need you to do that now more than ever, so please do. And another sort of Margaret Middletonism that has stuck with me is that any, museum or institution or place that has the opportunity to share queer history, if it's in their collection, if it's relevant to their stories, and they choose not to, that's not a neutral act necessarily. It's not, people might be saying, well, let's not get there. Let's not get political, but, or this is private information. We don't need to share their private lives. But that's why do we share the marital lives of straight people, but not queer people? This is not, it is not neutral to make the decision to not share the stories of queer people. So, first to think about that and your obligation to visitors for them to be able to see all stories reflected in history. Um, and that these personal connections are what's gonna stay with visitors and have them continue to be people who are interested in public history and engage with other public history institutions if they feel like their stories are being supported. um, and then yeah, if you're trying to do this work, that like it's more available than you think to find these stories. Margaret Middleton also suggests sort of like putting on your lavender glasses, tuning up your gaydar, and if you do that a little bit, you might find some stories there that you just weren't seeing before, but they are there, and that there are probably local historians and local institutions that have done some of this research that you can go to for consulting, for assistance, and to help bring those stories in. And so if you're wanting to start getting that research into your institution, that you're not alone in doing that, and other people can come in and support you, and you just have to find them, and they're there.
Yeah, I love that, especially the idea that opting out is not actually a neutral option. It's a very specific choice.
Mhm.
Um, so that kind of covers what I had. If anyone watching has any questions, you could do one of two things. You could either be spotlighted and ask it yourself, or if you could do as Kate just did, and write out a question in the chat. I can read it now, such as the question that Kate She/Her asked: were you able to include a representation of historical queer people of color on the Rainbow Revolutionaries tour?
Yes, yeah. So I mentioned earlier George Middleton is one of the figures we talk about. George Middleton was a black man during the Revolutionary War period who was super involved in the really active black community of Beacon Hill and started an all-black sort of militia regiment of during the Revolution called the Bucks of America that was supported by John Hancock. And anyway, really cool story and really cool person. We talk about his life, and he is one of those figures where it is a little bit more nebulous to track down how queer he was or how he identified, but that there is a lot of evidence that points towards him living a queer life or perhaps a bisexual life, and that this is one of those instances of erring on the side of queerness, or to at least talk about the parts of his life that seem that are queer in flavor. Um, we talk a little bit about Althea Garrison, who's a really interesting figure, who is the first trans person to serve on the House of Representatives, but who was not who was outed against her will in the time when this happened, and has had a lot of interesting political. She's still alive. She was serving after Ayanna Pressley left. She took her seat on the Boston City Council, and yeah, she just has a really interesting life, and she's a trans woman of color. So yeah, we have highlighted people of color as well during this tour.
Excellent. From Cecilia Weaver, we have how did the Freedom Trail Foundation reply to your proposal, especially considering it seems to be pretty rare that you add on a new tour. I believe we said in the introduction, it was the first new tour in 6 years,
Yeah,
or something like that.
6 years.
Did you deal with any pushback from any higher ups, board members, donors? Obviously, don't want to
No,
get
yeah,
too into
it
that,
was
but
it was like largely supported. We had this talk with the executive director. She told us to go for it. I think, one of the hardest things about it was just that I had to do this a lot of work without a team. And that it was during, the rest of my other kind of work and operations, and I had to carve out this time for myself to work on creating the tour in between my other duties that are sort of my daily duties. And then the tour did need to get approved by the board once it was ready, but we just had kept them informed all throughout the development of the tour. And as far as I remember, no board members, felt like this shouldn't happen. I'm curious, if this were to happen now, if that would, in 2025, if there would have been more pushback or something. But it was fully supported in 2024, and so yeah, it was just we were able to make it happen.
fantastic. Question from Dan Howlett. Given the tour covers history into the 2000s, do you have any visitors involved in Boston queer history that have come on the tour and shared information with the tour guides? And is there a way for you to collect those oral histories if they come up?
That's a good question. Yeah. Um, I mean, I've heard, any feedback that I get from the tour guides is just kind of they opt into sharing with me, like, oh, this happened to me. Um, I can't recall any specific cases of necessarily like someone who is really involved right now as a queer historian saying, you should talk about this, you should talk about this. I imagine that the guides are having all kinds of conversations with the guests on the tours that I'm just not aware of afterwards. And I what we did this year is the guides, I had like send me if there are stories that you have done research on, in the year since last year, or if there are stories that, during your training period you felt like you wanted to share that weren't included in the outline, can you share those with me? And I will add them to, I will do a little research, create some like links and things for you to go do more research about. And then I put together a document that's just supplemental historical information for the Rainbow Revolutionaries tour. And then I just kind of add to that document and reshare it when it's, created, when it's been updated. So I think it'd be a great idea to just really like talk to the guides about, hey, what if you do hear more stories, if you do have a really cool encounter with somebody on your tour, send me an email or come talk to me at my desk. Let me know that this happened. Get me in touch with that person if they want to get in touch with me, let's collect this. The foundation doesn't necessarily have an archives or a collection space. So that would be the kind of thing where maybe like history project should take that on or we'll continue to be in partnership. I'll send folks your way, whatever happens. But for us to be able to continue to tell these stories and to add them to the tour when possible is definitely something that we are thinking about and making moves on.
Yes, absolutely. And to your point about getting us involved, Matisse just also said in the chat that we have a whole dedicated oral history team that is always happy to sit down with people who are interested in telling their stories. So if anything comes up, we would love to hear from you.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to be in touch.
All right. Does anyone have anything else? Thank you to Kate, Celia, and Dan for your amazing questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Um,
I have a question.
yes, but
Um,
I think we just had a couple more questions come in too. So,
Hi.
Matisse, hello.
Oh, we did. Hi. I want to know about like what the process is like knowing that this has to be like on foot. Like, does that shape the history that you tell? I think we talked on it a little bit more, but like, what is the on footness of it all? Like, how does that shape the history that you're making? I know you said you're relegated to the actual trail itself or like nearby. I don't know. I know, Theo, you've also developed walking tours too. So I'm just curious about the like the length of it, how much information, how does the walking tour component really factor in? If you want to talk about that, that would be interesting.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I think that was one of the biggest challenges of developing this was like getting the timing to work out and create and thinking of linking sites that are not too far of a walk from each other and creating a route that logistically makes sense. And we were fortunate to be able to figure out a route that kind of starts and ends at where our usual tours roughly start and end. Um, yeah, I think in some cases it took a little bit of creative, like creating these themes. And, for example, we go to the Beacon Hill Friends House, which is it's a Quaker meeting house that's currently used as kind of it's both a residential, co-op kind of living space and a community events space, and still functions as a place where Quaker meetings take place every Sunday. So it still has that religious tie, but the folks who live there don't necessarily have to be practicing Quakers, if I um, am getting my information correct about it. But like, how do we talk? The house doesn't necessarily have historic ties, but when we talk about the public universal friend, this is a person who was originally a Quaker and then who, develops a new kind of religious doctrine that is based on a lot of Quaker principles, is slightly tweaked, but is still like really founded in Quaker principles. And so, we're getting a little bit creative with stopping at the Beacon Hill Friends house. However, it is also like a really great queer resource of this place. Like they are super queer positive as an organization. There's like a bunch of rainbow flags right out the front of that building. So it's great to like bring that modern color into going to a historic spot or a spot that we're telling a historic story at, and then to see the modern ways that buildings are being used as queer safe spaces and community spaces. Um, so that's interesting. Things like the Tremont Theater is like the Tremont Temple now and doesn't have really like the remains of its theater background there, and you can't really go inside of it. It's not really a historic site. I think you can go inside, but I don't know, it's not like a historic site in the same way. But there's so much history there that's really interesting to learn about, and we've got like the Omni Parker House and Tremont Temple being right next to each other, and all of the ties to Charlotte Cushman that both of those sites have are really valuable. So I think we just try to think about like what are the stories of these sites that we know. And we use the Old Corner Bookstore to talk a lot about Boston marriages because of Annie Adams Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett and their Boston marriage, but also to highlight just like the greater theme of literary and artistic people in the like late 19th century, early 20th century, that there's like a booming community of literary and artistic folk that are living quite queer lives, that there are lots of Boston marriages or queer men, gay men, that are involved in this literary community. So I don't know. So that's I guess I'm going off on a tangent, but we just try to link the sites in a way that makes it sense to walk to these stops to be able to tell the stories. We kind of gauge like roughly 5 to 10 minutes for the storytelling component, and then timing out how much you're walking between them. And I think a lot of it just kind of ended up being lucky. Like we tried a route this was like first draft route. We tried it out, and then the timing kind of worked out right off the bat, and we were like, great, let's keep that. Let's just maybe do some little tweaks in terms of how much time we're spending at each site, and that can change, depending on how long it takes to walk from one site to another, but it actually kind of just worked.
Always great when that happens.
Yeah.
Uh, Question from Jim Moser. Lynn, Massachusetts has recently completed a project on LGBTQ plus history. Did you uncover any stories with connection to Lynn? And Matisse, for the history project side, did kind of answer this as well, saying that we, with the history project, have materials about the famed bar Fran's Place. Did you come across anything Lynn related on your
I don't
research
remember
journey?
any Lynn related information, and I'll admit that like I filtered out a lot of non-Boston specific information, although, we did dabble in some that were just kind of like this is Massachusetts. Um this kind of makes me think of things like, I think a lot of this tour doesn't bring a lot of the more recent kind of 1950s and on nightlife queer history that exists in Boston and beyond, and talking about some of these really old bars that have existed, and or areas where these bars used to be that the bars no longer stand there, but have been transformed. And I think I've taken some other queer history tours. I've taken one in Philadelphia. I've taken a few others, and a lot of the time I'll see that they'll go around these kind of neighborhoods or like gayborhoods, areas where a lot of nightlife and bars were, and that semi exists in Boston, but it's not as strong. Or is like localized. I think there's a lot of like you have to go here, here, or here to go to a bar, and they're not going to all be in the same neighborhood. So I opted to tend towards some of the like less common, more older, maybe things that you wouldn't necessarily think of when you think of queer history, because it is sort of like assumed that queer people weren't really being queer in the 1700s or 1800s, and then to try to like challenge that rather than, there's going to be other places that are doing the stories of the nightlife history, which is also really fascinating and great to know about.
So we have two questions from Bosto. First one is there a chance this tour will happen throughout the year? Basically, what times of year do you offer this tour?
Yeah, so when we launched it in 2024, it was offered just through the month of June, for Pride Month, that kind of thing. This year, we are trying to make an effort towards detokenizing some of these specialty tours. So, throughout the summer, we've been offering it June, July, and August. And then the one that we're doing with History Project next week on the 21st, is a special date that we added in for this partnership. Um, we did just discuss our September schedule and are likely, unfortunately, not going to be continuing this one into September. Part of the reason for that is that so we have a couple other specialty tours. We have African American Patriots tour and a Revolutionary Women tour, and we've been offering those throughout the summer as well. So we have kind of one for each month, one each a month, if that makes sense. So three specialty tours per month that are running. So that we, because the idea is the equity of all of these stories being told. And unfortunately, we haven't seen as much interest in the African American Patriots Tour and the Revolutionary Women Tour, and the Rainbow Revolutionaries Tour is getting a lot more folks on it, which is really cool. But we're trying to figure out how to get people to take the other tours as well. And yeah, if the other tours, if we chose to just continue the Rainbow Revolutionaries tour without also continuing the other two, there would feel like some discomfort about continuing it that way. So we're just in discussion about how we want to continue to offer these specialty tours.
Hopefully, we can get all three back in the rotation very soon.
Mhm.
And Bosto's other question is, again, looking further off the Freedom Trail than you may have been looking. But were there any queer people in Salem or connected with the Salem witch trials connected to Boston? Um, Basically in Salem witch trials connections.
I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm almost certain there are. I know that there is a queer walking tour in Salem that usually runs in June as well, that I have not yet had the pleasure of taking, but I have some friends who are part of the team that guide those tours, and it seems, yes, the Rainbow Stroll just posted in the chat in the links there. So um, I would imagine that, so if they're doing the walking tour in Salem, that there's got to be some Salem queer history ties in there, and there's probably some witch trials information in there. And I would love to take the tour and absorb that knowledge and have it and bring it to the Freedom Trail if relevant. So, but if you're interested, those are the folks to talk to.
Yes, couldn't agree more. Despite being a Salem resident, and it's where I'm calling in from tonight, I also have not had the opportunity to go on that either, but I have heard nothing but good things.
Yeah, likewise. And I see that Sebastian as a public history icon was shared in the
Yes.
comments, who is a friend and is a phenomenal source.
Yes, I also know Sebastian. Seems
Yeah,
like everybody knows everybody
everybody
in
knows
public history world.
Sebastian.
We all know Sebastian. All right. Um, are there any other questions from the audience tonight? Otherwise, we're just after 8 o'clock, so filled our time, and this was a really excellent discussion.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much, Theo, for opening the channels and talking to me and having good questions.
Yes, thank you for being here and taking the time to tell us more about this amazing tour. And one last plug for it, you can get tickets for the tour that is going to be run next week. And
Yeah, it's
it'll
on
definitely be worth your time.
Thursday, August 21st, starting at 6 o'clock. You'll meet in front of the Massachusetts State House near the Robert Gould Shaw and 54th Massachusetts Regiment Memorial.
All right. I think that'll do it. Thank you
Great.
everyone for coming, and have a good rest of your night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for coming. We hope to see you again.